Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's meeting regarding the proposed changes to Wake County's noise ordinance. I'm Liz Oliver. I'm a project administrator working on the Noise Ordinance Review Committee. And then also joining us from that committee today, we have Captain Welsh from the Wake County Sheriff's Office, Jeff Pearson, our Code Enforcement Program Manager, Caroline Simpson, our Senior Business Analyst, and Planning Director Tim Maloney. And Tim is going to really kick us off today by sharing some information regarding the proposed changes and what the next steps will be in this process. Before we get into that, I just want to mention that anytime during the presentation, you can comment in chat. If you're attending via Zoom, you can select the chat button across the bottom of your screen. And for those who are joining on Facebook or YouTube, you can just type a message into the comments area under the video. After Tim's presentation concludes, that's when we will address any chat comments and we'll open the floor for Zoom attendees to unmute and to respond with questions or comments. I'll provide some more direction on that following Tim's presentation. And with that said, I will turn it over to Mr. Tim Maloney.
Great. Thank you, Liz. I appreciate that introduction. Good afternoon. I am Tim Maloney. I'm the Director of Planning, Development, and Inspections with Wake County. Today, we're going to present to you proposed amendments to the Wake County Noise Ordinance. The purpose of this effort is to consider changes to the ordinance that will better define what and how we control noise. The Wake County Noise Ordinance only applies to the unincorporated areas of the county and is enforced by the Wake County Sheriff's Office. So I really do want to make this clear. The ordinance we're talking about today is specific to the county's unincorporated areas. It does not apply to Raleigh or any of the other towns like Cary or Apex, as they have their own noise ordinances that apply to their jurisdictions. Raleigh happens to be going through the same process that we are right now with proposed amendments to their ordinance. So I want to be sure that we're not confusing our process with theirs. So they are separate processes. The county's current ordinance was established in 1986 and remains largely unchanged since that time. We've had minor amendments in 93, 94, and 2004, but they were not substantive changes. So over the past few years, staff has recognized the need to review and update our ordinance. The current ordinance outlines noises that are prohibited, such as loud radios, sound magnifying devices, unauthorized events creating loud noise, and other noises that are enumerated in the current ordinance. It also outlines noises that are exempt, like emergency service vehicle sirens and other things that might emanate from emergency service vehicles, or say construction during the daytime hours. In determining violations, the ordinance does specify maximum noise limitations pursuant to decibel limit limitations. For example, it says during the daytime hours, noise decibel readings should not exceed, say, a certain limit. During the nighttime hours, it should also not exceed a certain limit. It also goes into a very prescriptive method for using a sound meter when measuring the sound. It gets into things like the distance from the sound, the height of the device, calibration of the device, and say proximity that the operator can be to the sound meter. And it goes on about other things as well. It's very prescriptive. And lastly, a violation of the ordinance currently is a Class 3 misdemeanor and is subject up to a fine of $50 or imprisonment up to 30 days. So as a reminder, the noise ordinance for Wake County does not apply to, say, commercial businesses. Instead, we have operational performance standards specific to noise within our land development ordinance that apply to those types of uses. So this doesn't apply to, say, commercial zoning uses. So here are some of the issues with our current ordinance and the enforcement. The primary issue is the impracticality of using a sound meter as prescribed in the ordinance to determine if the noise is too loud or not. A deputy would have to go downtown to get the sound meter. By the time they arrive at the scene, the noise is generally gone. In actuality, deputies do not retrieve the sound meter, but go directly to the incident when they get the call, and they make their own determination on site if the noise is disturbing. Secondly, language in the current ordinance is not clear on how and who enforces the ordinance, as well as other options that complainants may pursue, like, say, filing a civil suit with the county magistrate. Also, the current penalty for violation within the current ordinance does not align with the statutory limits, which is a Class 3 misdemeanor and a fine up to $500. Remember, I said it's currently $50 in our ordinance. Statutory limit is up to $500. And then lastly, and probably the biggest gap we have, which has nothing to do with the ordinance itself, is how we give, is that we don't give any guidance for residents on how to resolve noise issues, either on their own or even what happens when they call in a complaint. And I'll share more on this in a few slides. A key part of our effort was looking at noise call data collected by the sheriff's office. We looked at the past 5 years, which totaled over 5,500 calls. The busiest year, as you can see here on the chart to the left, was in 2020, when they averaged about 3.5 noise calls per day. Whether this relates to the pandemic, when many folks stayed at home, could be a reason why. The table on the right shows the breakdown between just loud noise and noise specific to loud music. I shared this so that everyone can get an idea of the volume for these types of calls into the sheriff's office. Here's some further breakdown on the disposition of calls. It can be a little difficult to drill down into each disposition, since each responding deputy may characterize the outcome a little differently than another. However, we're able to determine that around 65% of these were enforceable, while the rest were likely unenforceable for reasons we don't specifically know. Why it was canceled, why it was referred to another agency, might have been through another jurisdiction, why it was unfounded, is a little difficult to drill down any further than that. We also thought it would be useful to see how these calls looked on a map. So we created what we call this heat map. You can see where the concentrations are in the red shaded areas. Again, this is just the county's jurisdiction, as that's where our noise ordinance applies. The yellow dots are loud noise complaints, and the blue dots are the loud music complaints. So 97% of these calls are within the sheriff's enforcement zone. Again, county unincorporated, which means probably a few were called in and were actually in, say, the corporate limits. Another key element of our research was reviewing ordinances from other jurisdictions. And through that review, we were able to determine that our current ordinance, generally aligns with others as it pertains to the items listed here on the screen. Many of them have and define nighttime and daytime hours. Some have decibel limitations with a measurement standard with a sound meter. Some do not. Enumerated noises that are prohibited or exempt are typically listed in a noise ordinance. Complaint procedures can be defined in noise ordinances, and I think that's one area that we can do a little better within our noise ordinance. Enforcement action can be described, and they typically state what the penalty for violation is for that noise ordinance. So our findings and analysis bring us to this, and there's 3 key points to it. First, that the current ordinance that we have in place is still relevant and useful, but it doesn't require a complete rewrite, maybe just some updating and some clarifications, which we have proposed. Secondly, enforcement is working, but it's not in alignment with the maximum noise limitation standards that we talked about earlier, those decibel measurements that are specified. And then lastly, and most important, information, education, and guidance for residents on our website about noise issues is desperately needed. So here are some of our draft recommendations. To see the detailed changes, they can be found on our website, which I'll provide at the end of this presentation. First, and the most significant change, is to eliminate the noise limitation standards as measured in decibels. With this, we would eliminate the use of a noise meter in determining compliance with the ordinance. Why eliminate this? Well, we're not doing it right now, and enforcement is working without it. Having these decibel standards in the ordinance when not enforced or measured is not helpful to the complainant or the sheriff's office. Instead, we want to move to what is called the reasonable person, unreasonable noise standard. Raleigh is proposing a similar change to their ordinance. It allows the investigating deputy to determine if the person complaining about that noise is a reasonable person and the noise is being witnessed, and the noise being witnessed is an unreasonable noise. And both these terms are defined as part of our proposed text amendment. Again, this is how it's being enforced now without issue. So we're proposing to align enforcement with the ordinance. Moving down the list to number 3, we're proposing to expand the exemption for agriculture and farming operations. Currently, farming operations are exempt from the noise ordinance only during the daytime hours, which are 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. The changes would make it exempt any time of the day or night, and the activity of farming would be tied to state law that defines what farming is. Number 4, we propose to add exemptions for public services, airport operations, and authorized sporting events. These are typical in other ordinances that we research, but not currently in ours. Number 5, we're adding language that states enforcement of the ordinance lies with the Wake County Sheriff's Office. And 6, that we provide clarification of the enforcement process. Number 7, there is added language clarifying that the complainant can also pursue a criminal summons with the Wake County Magistrate should they feel enforcement by the Sheriff's Office was not satisfactory. Number 8, we propose to amend the penalty for violation to align with the state law limits. I mentioned this earlier, which is a class 3 misdemeanor and a fine up to $500. Our current ordinance is up to $50. And then lastly, I've mentioned this before as well, provide information and guidance to residents on how to resolve noise issues, either on their own or by issuing a complaint. This will be an entirely new web page with useful information on this topic. So I mentioned a moment ago an area that we can improve upon, which is providing that information on our website. Guidance that can help them either address the situation on their own or who to call when they need assistance and what to expect when they do make that call. So here's an example from Montgomery County, Maryland, where they're providing guidelines for being a good neighbor, but then also what to do if disturbances don't stop. Here's another example from Long Beach, California. This helps residents navigate who to call when they have a disturbance of some sort. As a part of this process, we wanted to ensure that we give residents the opportunity to weigh in on the proposed changes. So today, we're conducting this virtual public meeting to gather feedback on those changes. Details about today's meeting were pushed out through our social media channels and through a news media release. Prior to the meeting, we posted information on our website that included the proposed changes and a feedback form, as you see here on the screen. If not already, feel free to go to wake.gov/noise to review the changes in more detail and provide any feedback. So speaking of feedback, we've already started to gather some through the online feedback form. Here are some of the themes on the screen that we're hearing about already. Several are concerned that eliminating the decibel measurement standards will leave enforcement ambiguous and inconsistent. It's hard to argue against that. But as I mentioned earlier, that's how we're enforcing it right now. There's an impracticality, as I mentioned before, with using the sound meter. It must be available, the operator must be trained, and follow very prescriptive guidelines in the ordinance. And obviously, the sound needs to be present by the time the deputy gets out there. And we've learned that other jurisdictions have that same issue with enforcement through a sound meter process. And like Raleigh, they are also proposing to move away from decibel measurements. Vehicle noise, that can be difficult to enforce since it's usually a moving target. We have language in the ordinance now, and there is also state law that regulates excessive noise from vehicle exhaust systems. Nighttime hours is obviously a debatable standard. During our peer review of other jurisdictions, we came across others that were the same and some that differed slightly. We saw on some occasions where the nighttime hours might be 10 to 7. And then lawn equipment is restricted to the daytime hours currently in our ordinance, as is loud music prohibited anytime. And we're not proposing any changes to those two. So, next steps. Public outreach is now underway. Our website is up and running, as I mentioned earlier. We're conducting today's virtual public meeting. Staff is going to be presenting these recommendations at the Board of Commissioners work session on October 9th at 2 p.m. And you can stream that on our website. After that presentation, state law does require there be 2 Board of Commissioner meetings to consider adoption of these changes. We are tentatively targeting the 2 dates that you see on the screen, November 6th for a public hearing, at which time any resident will have the opportunity to speak before the board in person. And then a follow-up meeting, it would be a second reading on November 20th for consideration of adoption. And again, those are tentative dates, and we will post these on our website. So I'm going to stop there, and we will open it up for discussion and questions, and I'll turn it over to Liz.
Excellent. Okay, so like Tim said, we are ready to start responding to comments. I see we have one in chat so far, and at this time, feel free to add other comments to chat. We also want to open the floor for anyone who wants to verbally provide their feedback. So if you would like to speak, we just ask that you would raise your hand, and you can do that if you are a Zoom attendee by going to the reactions category that's along the bottom of your Zoom window. You may have to click on the 3 dots to get there, but you should see that it says raise your hand. And then when we see your hand go up, we will, in order that we see it go up, call on you, and then you will be able to unmute yourself. So when you hear your name, go ahead and unmute, and you can do that now. Raise your hand. And then we'd like to try and keep each comment to a couple minutes if possible. We definitely want to give everyone a chance to participate. We'll see how much feedback we have. Maybe that won't be an issue. If you're not joining via Zoom, we will still be able to pass any questions posted in chat along to our team, so don't hesitate to input something there. We'll try to get to as much as we can today. If you end up having any technical difficulties sharing your input, or you think of something after the fact, you can always submit your feedback to our form, which I will be linking here in the chat. You could fill it out multiple times. That's definitely okay. We will be compiling a Q&A document that addresses the questions that are being submitted, and that will be posted back online. And so with all of that said, we'll go ahead and take our first question.
Okay, I'll read the first question from the chat, and then we'll get to our people with their hands raised after that. So Tim, the first question is, I would like to bring up that the sheriff's office was mistaken for calls that have been made on the timeframes for the noise. They would have listed them as unfounded for months, so the data is skewed. It was allowed for construction to go into 11 p.m. This is against the ordinance, but the sheriff's office stated it wasn't. I would also like to ask why the time limits for construction are not revised to reasonable timeframes. 7 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. is extremely disruptive and traumatizing to residents.
Thank you for that question. And I can't speak specifically to an instance that the sheriff's office may have mistaken a call for the timeframes, but I can say that in providing some clarification, currently the ordinance does allow for construction to occur from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. So that's how it's currently stated. And right now we are not proposing to make that change. But we have seen some ordinances where there are, it's not as late as 11 p.m. And that's a consideration that the board could take up when we do present it to them. And we can share this comment with them. And we've heard it from other feedback that there are similar concerns about construction going to too late at night. A lot of the comments that we get, or a lot of the calls that my office gets about construction are typically about construction starting too early in the morning before 7 a.m. And when we get those calls, we do remind the builders and the contractors that they cannot start before 7 a.m. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question completely, but consideration can be given to changing those daytime hours, which are currently 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., inclusive of construction occurring.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Our next question is from John. I'm clicking the button to ask you to unmute, so you should be able to speak now.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so I have three brief comments. First of all, my name is John Argentati. I live at 2429 Lowwater Drive. I'd like to talk about noise harassment. So I'd like the committee to please consider adding a provision to address the use of noise as a means of harassment. Okay, this is when someone deliberately violates the noise ordinance with the intention of disturbing a particular person. It would be helpful if there were additional penalties associated with this sort of illicit behavior. My wife and I have been a victim of this. So last December, I reported a neighbor for operating his ATV on an all-terrain vehicle on a public road. And I was listed as witness number 1 on the citation. And immediately after receiving the citation from Highway Patrol, my neighbor, who is the defendant, and an associate of his began a noise harassment campaign targeting my wife and I. They have been intentionally disturbing us with loud vehicles on a daily basis for 9 months now, sometimes at 2 a.m. I've tried to involve the Wake County Sheriff's Department, but to date, the Sheriff's Department has not taken any action and has not really been helpful in this situation. The second item I think that the committee should address are all-terrain vehicles. There are a significant number of people in Wake County who intentionally make loud and disturbing noise with their all-terrain vehicles and dirt bikes, oftentimes in residential neighborhoods. Please consider adding all-terrain vehicles and dirt bikes to 92B. The third thing I'd like to mention are gas-powered leaf blowers. It seems that the current changes exempt the use of gas-powered leaf blowers, which can be extremely loud and disturbing. And quieter electric blowers are widely available now. So I'd like to ask that the committee please consider addressing that. So those are all of my comments. Thank you very much.
John, thank you for those comments.
Okay, we have one, let's see, a follow-up question from the first, from the lady who was clarifying something about her first question. She'd like to clarify that she reached out to the city And the ordinance for construction is limited to 7 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. per section G. I'm unsure if this is changing. Please, can you confirm if the city would now allow to 11 p.m.?
I'll try to clarify that. I'm not familiar with all the changes within the city's proposed amendments to their noise ordinance. They may very well be changing it. I don't even know what their current time frame is. My familiarity with the city's ordinance is not very good. All I can tell you is that with the county's ordinance, which only applies to unincorporated areas of the county, it doesn't apply to the city of Raleigh. So if you live in the city of Raleigh, this noise ordinance would not apply to you that we're talking about today. In the county unincorporated, it is currently 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. and we are not planning on any changes to that at this point.
Thanks, Tim. Those are all the questions we have in the chat, and I don't see anyone else with their hands up. Stacy, do we have any questions from social media?
We do not have any comments at this time on Facebook or YouTube.
All right, well, if anyone has a comment that springs to mind here in the next couple of minutes, feel free to go ahead and shoot that hand up or put it in chat. We definitely want to give you a platform to be heard. But for the questions that we did receive and comments, thank you very much. I mean, this is all a part of a process that is going to help guide the county's approach to this ordinance. And so we appreciate everyone who took the opportunity to share their feedback and to listen and hear about what is in the works.
Liz, we do have another question that just came in.
Okay.
This is from John again. Are barking dogs covered in this ordinance?
Good question, John. Yes, dogs are covered in the ordinance. There is a provision in the ordinance specific to animals and other noises from, I think it's birds, and I don't remember the exact language in the ordinance, but it is covered within the ordinance for animal noise, yes.
Well, as a reminder, you can stay updated on this initiative at wake.gov/noise, and the link is in the chat for that. And there you will continue to find the latest of our proposed changes and the timeline of next steps. And as a reminder, the next meeting is a Board of Commissioners work session that is on October 9th at 2 p.m. And that will include a public hearing. So you'll have an opportunity to speak there if you would like. There is also an option to submit feedback online the day of that meeting if you would not be able to attend in person. So that could be something to consider. And with that said, this concludes our meeting today. Thank everyone for joining us and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.